Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9 of the course. So, I've got two supplemental readings for this week that nicely tie together some things that add to Laporte's narrative. And we're dealing with the era just before and during World War II, which we'll be dealing with again next week. For this week, I've got an excerpt from a book by Glenda Gilmore called The Radical Roots of the Civil Rights Movement that reframes the way we think about civil rights, really pushing the narrative back farther than, the civil rights movement sort of starting with Rosa Parks deciding to not give up her seat on the bus. She's really showing that civil rights had been going on for decades before that. The other book is by Ronald Takaki, and it discusses the diversity of soldiers who fought in the Second World War. So, with this presentation, I want to try to give some context to those readings, and of course, end with some bonus questions. So, the first slide you're looking at illustrates the way World War II has been mediated for most of us, I think it's fair to say, which is through movies. The way we remember the war, the way we learn the dominant lessons about the war are through movies, and that's true for those of us who are historians as well. So there are a range of movies that have been absolutely foundational in the construction of American collective memories of World War II, meaning, the shared ideas, motifs, and lessons that we tend to draw from it, even while those ideas are contested. So World War II is something that's been narrated perhaps more than any other war in our history because its story of the triumph of good over evil resonates with us. It's also the war that established the United States as an undisputed world power. So the final movie on the right of this slide, Saving Private Ryan, came out in 1997, and it emerged in an era when the United States was beginning to grapple with global hegemony for perhaps the first time in American history. So I want to shift now to. So on this slide, I've got a movie that tried to diversify our perceptions of World War II. There's certainly have been many movies like that by focusing on the Tuskegee Airmen. This movie is actually quite dull, but I understand that a newer movie, Red Tails, is done quite well. I haven't seen it yet. The movie on the right, then, is not real. I made it up. And in my assessment of World War II, the most significant American contribution was its industrial might. The U.S. did not do most of the fighting, but its industrial capacity dwarfed that of the rest of the world. So the mighty Chinese Nationalist Army, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the Free French, and a whole host of resistance movements around the world were dependent on U.S. industrial production for their survival. The U.S. military was certainly not shabbily equipped either. Yet, to my knowledge, the movie on the right doesn't exist yet. A movie celebrating the war winning contributions of women of color. Let me switch now. Last week, I mentioned that African American support for the Communist Party in the 1930s uh, was huge, and that African Americans were among the key members of the Communist Party in this era as well. So intellectuals, especially from Harlem, found the message of absolute equality to be extremely powerful. The Communist International mobilizations against fascism in the 1930s were particularly meaningful for African Americans as well, as the policies of Hitler had resonance for people living under the mind numbing restrictions of Jim Crow. And like I mentioned last week, the Hitler Stalin Pact at the beginning of World War II turned many African Americans and other American communists off of Stalin and away from the Communist Party. To see a party so committed to principles compromising on its principles was a deal breaker for so many people. One of the I don't want to put myself with the Scottsboro boys. That seems like a sacrilege. No, put myself up here, tiny. So, one of the turning points in African American support for the Communist Party in the 1930s was the trial of the Scottsboro Boys. So, in 1931, 9 black teenagers were riding in a boxcar in Alabama. They were indigent youth, like many in the early terrible years of the Great Depression, who traveled on boxcars looking for work, looking for food, looking for whatever. And as they were riding on a train, some white youth told them to leave the boxcar as they claimed it was segregated. The black boys resisted and won. They got into a fight with the white teenagers and beat them up. So, 2 girls who were with the white boys decided to accuse the black teenagers of rape. We've had a very terrible reckoning just this year with people who weaponize their claims of victimhood against black males. Unfortunately, it's a very old story in our country. So in this case, in 1931, the boys were arrested. One was only 12 years old, and the death penalty was sought for them all. This is when the Communist Party got involved, defending them for free in the hopes of both publicity for the party and international publicity about the depravity of America's race relations. They worked with, not always amiably, the NAACP. The NAACP worried that the communists were sort of showboating this trial, whereas the NAACP was more about, saving these boys. So, but together, the NAACP and the Communist Party were able to make this into an international media event. The all-white jury still found all of these young men guilty, even though the defense showed that the accusers had made contradictory statements, and one of the accusers even admitted that she was lying. Four of the boys were held until 1937, and the others weren't released until the late 1940s. And I just want to be clear that this ruined their lives. They suffered terrible abuses in prison. Uh, most of these young men ended up dying early, in large part because of the suffering they endured, and it was a mess. Uh, but the fact that the Communist Party was willing to defend them so vociferously helped them to win support of many African Americans, again, until they lost it in 1939, as I mentioned both this week and last week already. So I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of weeks talking about positive things, progressivism, anti-racism, and the policies of the New Deal. One thing that was contemporary to all of these ideas was hatred. Um, sorry, I just burped. I drank kombucha for the first time because my son saw it on a movie and wanted to try it. It's disgusting, but very good for you, apparently. So the hatred was contemporary with all of these ideas. So the Ku Klux Klan was at its height in the 1920s. Way back in 1915, D.W. Griffiths produced a movie called Birth of a Nation that glamorized the Klan as the heroes who protected white people from black tyranny in the post Civil War period of Reconstruction. As I mentioned on the second week of class, that idea that Reconstruction was black tyranny persisted for decades. It still informed the history I learned in the Wisconsin school system in the 1980s. Wisconsin, mind you, was in the North during the Civil War and fought bravely to put down slavery and the racism that underpinned the Confederacy. So a bunch of middle-aged white men who liked the movie and wanted to feel important joined William J. Simmons, who also loved this dumb movie, to form the renewed KKK. And like the progressive movement, the KKK was meant to address the alienation of modern industrialized America by imagining a simpler time when foreigners, Catholics, Jewish people, and black people had less power. The renewed power of the KKK wasn't just in the South, but in northern states too, like Indiana, for example. The President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, was even rumored to be a member of the KKK in this period, a rumor that he did not dispel. So, this picture on the left shows a placard that the KKK put up in opposition to communist organizing. So, already, long before the Cold War started, there was this notion that communism was un American. And this slide just is a repeat. You've seen it already, pointing out that the KKK existed in a global ferment of extreme racism, especially in those settler colonial regimes, places like New Zealand, where uh, white white minorities or majorities or people who imagine themselves as white ruled over people of color, and so in the reading that you're looking at this week, you've got sort of an international tour of the appeal and lack of appeal of the KKK. So what's interesting is that in Germany, where Hitler rose, they sort of thought that the KKK was a little too goofy and unserious for the kind of racism that they were looking to have. But again, the period in between the world wars was one of extremism and a lack of faith in democracy around the world. And so, we often see Hitler and Mussolini as the prime bad guys of World War II and, the military regime in Japan as well. But at the bottom of this slide, I just want to emphasize that across Central and Eastern Europe and into the Middle East, there were willing allies of Hitler almost everywhere because we were in a global crisis of liberalism. And the KKK absolutely fits into these far right intolerant movements that were happening around the world in this period. So, with the next slide, Where did I put myself? I'll put myself over here by Dr. Odom. Okay, not to steal too much of his head there. So, while Gilmore does a great job pointing out the power of radical organizers in her excerpt, she reserves palpable vitriol for so called moderates of this period, supposed white liberals who wanted compromise or peaceful solutions to the racial inequality in the South. And one of these groups, formed by the guy pictured, was the Committee on Interracial Cooperation. Something Gilmore points out is that trying to compromise with absolute hatred in an era when people were regularly being lynched really wasn't possible and was actually quite disingenuous. So the CIC, Committee on Interracial Cooperation, believed that it could reduce lynchings, that it could help people be nicer to black people, but it never came out for legislation against lynching. It was unwilling to forcefully condemn the abuse, to forcefully condemn either segregation or even white supremacy in a way that would have allowed them to make allies out of groups like the NAACP, because they were too focused on presenting themselves as moderates. So, and indeed, members of the CIC often felt themselves to be superior to black people, but they felt that they could at least help develop them to be more like white people. So ultimately, it was those who fought for full justice and equality who won out in the civil rights movement, not this group. So with this slide, I want to switch now. Here, I don't want to get too close to her drill press. I'll be right about here. Um, I'm switching now to Takaki, and hopefully in a way that builds off of Gilmore. So, when the 1930s ended, African Americans were well organized. Between World Wars I and the 1940s, something known as the Great Migration had occurred, where millions of black people resisted Jim Crow with their feet. I thought about assigning the book The Warmth of Other Suns as one of our main textbooks this semester. I didn't. Maybe I will next semester. But it's a book by Isabel Wilkerson that chronicles the stories of several people who escaped to the North. Um, I I encourage you to read the book. It's absolutely amazing and completely inspiring. But one thing that many of these people who went north from the South were at first disappointed by, but then came to accept, was that there was racism in the North too, both the everyday kind and the deeper, more insidious, structural kind. So many people who fled for a better life were willing to fight for that better life too. So as military production began to lift the entire economy out of depression on the eve of World War II, African Americans had to fight for a right to contribute to that economy. You've got some inspiring acts of resistance by organized black people in the North, like the Dial Zero protest on May 5th, 1941 in Cleveland, where black women would pick up their phones and dial zero to overwhelm the operators at the Cleveland Telephone Company, whose job it was to connect calls. For those of you who remember landlines, I don't know how many of you still have them at home, you used to have the option to just press zero and talk to an actual operator for assistance in making calls. I remember when I was a kid, my little brother used to press zero all the time and just talk to the operator, and he called the operator his girlfriend. This is when he was like 4 or 5, and whoever the operator was just kind of thought it was cute and would talk to him for a long time. But anyways, so yeah, you can still dial zero oftentimes when you're calling big businesses today. So, anyways, black women were not allowed to work for the phone company in Cleveland, and so that was the whole purpose of this Dial Zero protest, just to overwhelm the phone lines and to take them out of commission. So, and it worked. Uh, one of the best jobs available to women was to be a telephone operator, and it was not available to black women. So, after this protest, black women won the right to work for the Cleveland Telephone Company, not as operators. They took it as a win. They were like, this is better than nothing. Our real goal is not necessarily to stamp out every injustice everywhere, it's to be able to feed our families. So, the example that I asked you to write about for your discussion board post is another one similar to that. It's the massive march on Washington, planned but not carried out, in large part by A. William Randolph, who was president of the National Porters Union, a predominantly African American union. So he promised to have 50,000 people come to Washington to protest lack of access to military production jobs for black people. He and the organizers likely would have had many more people. But in March 1941, President Roosevelt, not wanting both domestic and international embarrassment of a march highlighting American racism, agreed to desegregate defense industries. Randolph took it as a win and agreed to back down, hoping to instead preserve his relationship with Roosevelt in the hopes of continuing to make progress. Many of his allies leading the march were angry at him for calling it off, though, arguing that they had a national platform to call attention to the plight of African Americans in a period when lynchings were still happening around the country on a weekly basis. I asked all of you to weigh in on this for the discussion board to see what you think about the merits of both sticking to your goals versus compromising when fighting something as egregious as structural racism. Randolph, to his credit, would be one of the organizers of the March on Washington with Martin Luther King Jr. only 23 years later, so he certainly didn't forget his activist soul, even as he sought temporary compromise and accommodations for the betterment of the oppressed people that he represented as a Union leader. Oops, trying to switch. Okay, so as the war got underway, there were several high-profile attacks on black people that were called race riots in the media of the day. One notorious one occurred in Detroit in 1943. As a bit of background, by 1943, African Americans were well established in Detroit. Michigan had a long history of activism for abolitionism and had many important stations on the Underground Railroad. So in the defense plants of Detroit, basically converted automobile factories, there were black people with experience and seniority by the mid 1940s. Detroit was one of the prime destinations of people in the Great Migration fleeing the South as well. At the same time, by the 1940s, many poor white people began to flock to Detroit seeking job opportunities as well. These people were often from Appalachian regions in the South. So, as inexperienced and uneducated newcomers, they were on the bottom rung of the ladder, sometimes beneath black people. This caused a lot of tension because in the Jim Crow system they had left, they had come to accept their own oppression because at least they felt they were better than black people. So in June 1943, there was a rumor that started among the black community of Detroit that white people were abusing black children. White people, of course, rumored the opposite, that black men were abusing white children. And you have to remember that the entire racist structure of the South was built on this fear of black men. Uh, Completely irrational, but it was that is the mindset they're coming from. So fights broke out, and over a 3 day period, there was massive unrest in Detroit. Police and military forces were brought in to restore order because this is a city critical to war production. And in virtually every confrontation that was ongoing over these 3 days, they took the side of white protesters against black protesters. Those of you who were active this summer probably have a sense of deja vu hearing this. But of the 34 people killed in these riots, 25 were black. And the news reports of the time blamed the violence on uneducated, newly arrived African Americans. Well, with historical hindsight and better research, it seems that the tinderbox of violence was really stoked by recent white immigrants who resented a city where their familiar racial hierarchies seemed to be subverted. There were similar so called race riots in Chicago and Los Angeles during the Second World War as well. So, in the actual fighting of the war, I'll put myself right in the middle of Les Indigents, right there. Okay. So in the actual fighting of the war, which we'll read more about next week, people of color played an enormous role around the world. So the picture on the left is a recent Algerian movie. It's like 9 years old now, that sheds light on the suffering of Algerian troops in the Free French forces. The Free French forces were roughly 75% made up of Africans. The French resistance was largely made up of foreigners as well. French people, on the other hand, readily served in fascist Vichy forces and as volunteers in the SS Charlemagne division during the war. I point this out just to emphasize that people of color's contributions to the war efforts uh, around the world were largely unheralded by their own countries that they fought for. So, you know, racism was not just a problem in the United States. This is something that by the 1940s, especially with the injustices of colonialism, had expanded around the world. So, Those people of color fighting for France were in the most dangerous combat positions in the long, drawn out battle for Italy, for example, where it wasn't until the last week of the war that the northern Italian city of Trieste was finally liberated by British, Australian, New Zealander, French, meaning African, Yugoslav partisan, and Italian partisan forces. Again, like the fighting in Italy was perhaps the most unglamorous of the Western allies, and this is where the majority of African troops were sent, unglamorous and dangerous. So in the US, some African American accomplishments have been celebrated, like the famous Tuskegee Airmen. But one example in Takaki that I find particularly inspiring is that of African American logistics personnel, especially truck drivers. In the days after the D Day landings, there was a real fear of Germans posing as American soldiers trying to disrupt communications and hamper the advance of American and British and Free French and Canadian troops, all of whom had landed on the beaches at Normandy. So many of the Germans were actual Americans of German descent who had returned to fight for, who, people who they believed to be their Führer, the person who they believed to be their Führer. So, in order to keep fast moving troops supplied, commanders on the ground decided on a curfew for all troops, except for black truck drivers. They knew the racist Germans wouldn't have black people on their side, so it was African Americans who were indispensable to keeping the military forces supplied in the dangerous days and weeks after D Day. And I can't stress how incredibly important this was. And an army can't fight if it's not fed and if it's not supplied. So, I mentioned in this slide here that the enormous sacrifices of people of color in the Pacific campaigns, too, notably Chinese soldiers. So, in the end, World War II was celebrated as a global victory of human rights against intolerance. Yet, that battle for justice has had to be fought over and over again since the end of the Second World War. Whoop, not transfer. I'll put myself up a slide here. Okay, so in this slide, I've got a picture of another injustice against people of color. Here, Charles de Gaulle, the commander of the Free French forces, is pictured marching under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris on August 25th, 1944, celebrating the liberation of Paris. As he marched, he made sure that every single face marching with him was white, despite the fact that three-quarters of his troops were Africans. At the time he was marching, black and brown Free French forces were actually busy fighting a tank battle in the south of France. So, the irony of this picture is pretty disgusting. All right, I want to preview this slide. I'll put myself down here. I'm going to come back to this later in the semester, but for now, I just want to point out that World War II was a significant turning point in the global movement against colonialism. Before World War II, one of the areas where black people were the freest to think, write, and organize was in the United States of America, especially in black communities like Harlem and Chicago. The global center of anti colonial activity then was in Harlem. But after World War II, the nexus of anti colonial activity in the world shifted to Africa. And as Arab countries, followed by Ghana, gained their independence after World War II, African Americans began to look to Africa for inspiration in their own struggles against racism at home. By 1960, when most of Africa was independent, these new countries put pressure on the US and the institutions of the United Nations to do something about racism in their country. The Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations listened and helped to push forward civil rights legislation, in part because of this international shame. Yet, leaders of African American civil rights movements also found great inspiration in Africa, even in their travels to Africa. Here's Malcolm X, pictured in Egypt in 1964. He also traveled to Sudan, Nigeria, and Ghana, and as well as making a Hajj to Mecca. So, 2 weeks ago, I talked about African Americans providing hope for global people of color. By the 1960s, though, these people were returning the favor to African Americans. So, on that note, let's finish up and have some bonus questions. All right, I'll just get my face out of the way and pause on these bonus questions for a little bit, and then I'll make sure to post the PowerPoint on Vanco Hall for you to look at as well. And again, if you have any questions or want to talk about anything, please come to my office hours, which occur every Monday through Friday from 9 to 10 a.m. at the Vanco Hall site or at the Zoom link that's listed at the top of my Vanco Hall page. All right, thanks everyone. Hope you have a good week. Bye.